Off you go.
Tom Padden, this is my special subject investigation. My question was, what were the causes and influences of the punk movement and what was its lasting effects?
Okay.
So, first of all, just a little background. Obviously, we all know the punk movement was very influential. It influenced a lot of things that's still going on today in pop culture, influenced fashion at the time, everything. Like, that was the thing in the 1970s, 1977 specifically. It lasted 12 months only, really short period of time, but that's kind of what punk's all about, like live fast, die young sort of thing. So the economic aspects, there was an economical downturn in England or the UK at the time. There was no money, because there was no jobs going about, three-day working weeks, and literally that meant that for the youth, because you know, teenagers, like people had jobs but they were adults, so for people like us now at the time, there was just nothing to do, so people were referred to squatters, and these were people that went round to different houses and they sat in there, they took drugs, did nothing really. But one of the most famous squatters was Joe Strummer. Obviously Joe Strummer is the frontman of the Clash, big punk band, and so through that that's where he made lots of his connections and met people that would go on to be like also influential figures in punk. And he lived as a squatter, as an art student in London while he was studying. So moving on, the youth wanted something different. Yeah, they wanted something different because music at the time, glam rock, it was all kind of like songs that were musically
complex.
Yeah, complex. So for them, they couldn't really relate to it. It was the lyrics didn't really mean anything to them. It was all like well written stuff and not about anything particular. Like when you listen to David Bowie and his stuff, like talking about space, it's just like, well, yeah, that's musically brilliant and it's probably the hardest thing to do, to write a song about nothing. But it didn't mean anything for the people at the time. So they needed something different. So I'll just show just a little example of. By listening to it, you can hear how like you've got to be pretty well skilled just to play the sort of guitar melodies and stuff. And so that's all good for like a 38-year-old factory worker who's like listening to it because it's catchy or whatever. But like I keep like referring to, no one could, like the youth couldn't relate to it. So there was a thing called pub rock, which even still now and even like before I started researching all this, I didn't know what it was. But basically it was like just little bands playing covers of songs, but they'd do it in a different way. They won't just play the standard cover, they'd just beef up a bit. So like some of these bands did get like quite popular, like people go and watch them in various little venues, like you look at the Witchwood today, places like that. And they started getting offered contract deals and stuff, but they just refused it because they weren't bothered about that. They were doing it for fun and that's what they enjoyed. So this was coming quite popular. It was just pace and anger, that's what it was all about. And an example of this was Ian Jory, and he became part of he started off doing that, and he became part of a band called Ian During the Blockheads, which became quite big. He was quite an influential character just because of the way he acted. Just going back, I'll just show you a little clip. Oh well, it's not working. But yeah, basically that's what it was. It was like taking it back to like, because obviously you had the Rolling Stones and everything, which was like classic rock and roll. They were kind of doing that, but just like playing it with a bit more anger and a bit more aggression, so kind of leaning towards what punk was going into. So America, a lot of people say like punk started out in America, a club called CBGB's, where bands like the Ramones came from. And obviously in America, it was going through an economic sort of disaster around the time, but a little bit before punk came about, and they would, at the time they were just coming out of that, so so unemployment was decreasing, and yeah, they had their own oil supplies, which was obviously building up money, and so people were getting jobs and stuff, so it was nowhere near as bad as the state the UK was in. So in America, you had bands like the Ramones, but for me they weren't quite punk, because when you look at them you'd still see the glam influences, like the way they dressed, it was still all polished. It looked like they were still bothered about their image, which really glam rock was all about, that what David Bowie was doing. There wasn't really the right attitude like what we perceive as punk. So I'll just show you an example of that. It works. So we say this is punk because it's still taken 3 chords made into a short song, which is what punk is, but when you look at these images, it's just not quite there yet.
Eyes, oh, let's go. Eyes, oh, let's go. Eyes, oh, let's go. Eyes, oh, let's go. The moment is done. We're going through a tough one.
So there you can still hear like the kind of punk ethos. So basically, Malcolm McLaren, he was an owner of a shop on King's Road in London, and it was called Sex, and he was basically in a partnership with Vivienne Westwood, and she kind of had this idea and just started cutting clothes up and selling weird stuff in this shop with Malcolm McLaren, sort of like gimp suits and things. It was just all a bit crazy at the time. But Malcolm McLaren, he had this idea, and basically he went to America, and he obviously knew about pub rock going on in Britain. When he went to America, he seen the Ramones and New York Dolls and bands like that, and he just had an idea. He went, hang on a minute, if I can just take this idea, what they're doing with their songs and the structure, and go back to England, and maybe I could work this to give people a new meaning and a new direction in music. So when he went over to America, he came back, and then he formed Sex Pistols. Oh, there we go. So he comes back and he forms the Sex Pistols out of some people that used to come into his shop and rob, and he'd basically go over to him and he'd persuade him to learn the bass, and he asked him to play guitar, drums, etc. And then John Lydon, who's like probably the most, well, the one that everyone knows from the Sex Pistols, the lead singer, he was also one of them that robbed from the shop. So basically, as punk was just starting out, there was a gig in Manchester at the Free Trade Hall, and and the Sex Pistols were playing there, and it was 50p to get in, entrance. No one really knew they were at the time, but they just went because it was so cheap. And basically this gig was one of the most influential gigs I could think of. And that's because of the people that went there. So Morrissey was there from the Smiths, and at the time, or just after that gig, he joined a band called the Nosebleeds, who was like kind of a heavy metal / punk band before he was in the Smiths later on. Peter Hook from Joy Division and Bernard Sumner was there as well. They both in Joy Division, New Order. And Tony Wilson, who was the founder of Factory Records, who signed all those bands there. He also created the Hacienda Club, which was obviously massive in the 90s. And perhaps without that gig, he would never have gone on to do any of that. So you wouldn't have bands like Happy Mondays, OMD, Joy Division. Oh, sorry, just to say something about the Free Trade Hall gig as well. Peter Hook wrote a book, and in that book he's talking about when he went there, and basically he said the music was shocking and didn't sound good at all, but when John Lennon came on stage, there was only, they say there was about 20 to 30 people there, not a lot at all, and he came out and he just stared at everyone and like made complete like eye contact, and everyone was just shocked, never seen anything like it before. And after that, they came out of the gig and thought, well, if they can do that, we can do that. Because they weren't good at all, but the performance was amazing. So after that, they had the Anarchy Tour, which was basically loads of like bands that were upcoming. So the Clash were on there. Obviously the Sex Pistols were the main band, and yeah, they were just going on a tour around the UK. The Enemy advertised it, and it was kind of getting about that it was going on, but people had also heard rumours about all these like kind of fans that were all a bit crazy, and the bands were crazy, and they like fighting and causing riots and stuff. So venues started to ban this tour from going on. So if they were scheduled for Manchester next week, it'd get banned, for example. But that was kind of helping the punk movement, like, because all this like controversy was just turning it into a bigger promotion, and people like, oh, this is going out, this gig, we need to go to it, and that's how it kind of like built up momentum. Through this, people going watching these gigs, you had fanzines, which was basically just people making their own magazines about it, talking about the gigs and what were going on. And for me, this is like kind of exactly the same thing as what the bands are doing with the DIY ethos. They didn't need to be a journalist for Enemy, they just made their own. Like, the bands didn't need a record contract to play music, they just picked up a guitar and a mic and played. And from these band scenes, like, you've got people that are now who wrote these and made these, the people that are writing for like big newspaper companies and journalists for the news and everything. So just want to talk about the Jam a little bit, because the Jam were around at the time, and they was fully part of the punk movement. They started just before punk, but they still played at the time and everything, and punk fans were still fans of the Jam. But they didn't dress like punks, they dressed in a completely different way, kind of like a mod revival. But in the music you can still hear, like, it's got a short catchy song, it's still quite punchy. But they went on to outlast the movement, obviously made several albums. But I just wanted to like, I wondered if, well, who's more influential, the Jam or Sex Pistols, because Sex Pistols pretty much had one album that's still renowned now and still getting talked about, whereas the Jam I mean, I don't know if a lot of you have heard the Jam or know any of the songs, but they outlasted the movement, and that's what I'm trying to make, that they went on for a few years after that, but a lot of people now, like our generation, maybe wouldn't have heard of them, but everyone's heard of Sex Pistols, even though it was just one album. But because of the way they were so iconic, they've outlasted the Jam, really. So, oh sorry, I'll show you an example of the Jam. I was just going to show an example of a song called In the City. You can hear kind of like the punchy sort of guitar, even though it wasn't all it started like you'd expect punk to sound like. So yeah, the Punk's last hurrah. Sex Pistols on the Queen's Jubilee brought out a song called God Save the Queen. It's very sarcastic. And as the Queen's Jubilee was going on, they basically got on a boat on the River Thames and started performing. And straight away the police were surrounding them on the boats and taking them off in handcuffs. It was all kind of like a commercial stunt, but this was kind of like the end of the punk, because people were just getting sick of it and outgrowing it, and yeah. Don't know why some were working somewhere. So basically, Sex Pistols going off on a big tour in America. Malcolm McLaren decides to get rid of the original bassist, replace him with Sid Vicious. Sid Vicious couldn't play the bass. He literally just put him in there for image reasons, and obviously he looks the part, he looks like a punk, and he was completely an outrageous character. When they went to America, they met a girl called Nancy, and she kind of helped him along with the drugs, taking heroin and everything. But he leaves the Sex Pistols because of all this. Like, the band don't like him because he's getting all the big reaction, even though he's just joined them. So he goes on to release his own album, My Way, which is a cover of like a classic song, but it's turning it completely punk. But basically, yeah, he loses the plot. He kills Nancy. Well, we don't know if he kills Nancy. She's found like stabbed in the apartment, murdered. Some people say that they owed a drug dealer money and he's come in and killed her. And some people say he's just done it while he's been on drugs, but he completely denies it. And gets on bail and he kills himself. Because of that, he's probably become the most famous character from punk, really. And like he is the face of punk, even how we remember it today. But my point for that is, I feel like Malcolm McLaren could have stopped Life 22, could have stopped him from being a drug addict and destroying himself and destroying the Sex Pistols. But he didn't want that, because all he was bothered about was, well, people love him because of what he's doing. Like, going to gigs and hitting people with his bass, like, people loved it, that's what they went there for, to see him. So yeah, I sometimes feel like, or think that Malcolm McLaren kind of did this on purpose, turning him into that sort of character, and obviously it just got way out of hand. So punk's sort of on its way out, and the Clash signed to CBS, which is big record label, and that sort of seen as selling the punk movement out. They went on to do London Calling, which is probably known as one of the best British albums ever, or could be to some people. And it was still very punky, but it was more like polished punk. They've sort of got rid of the complete DIY ethos, signed to a big label. A lot of fans are going to be disappointed at that, because like, alright, the Clash, they were never punk. They've not just come out of nowhere. They sort of sounds out for the charts and everything. So after punk, we get post-punk, bands like Joy Division, going to stick with Joy Division. They're the most famous band anyway. So obviously Pete Hawke and Bernard Sumner, who were at the Free Trade Hall gig, they were two founding members of the band. And it features a lot of punk sort of musical features, but it's like kind of taken away using some synthesizers, not quite as angry. And just mentioned Spandau Ballet there, completely cheesy pop group, they sing Gold. Everyone knows that song. But Spandau Ballet means like the Jew camps, when people were getting hung, and concentration camps, sorry, not Jew camps. And the bodies were still twitching, they call it Spandau Ballet. So even though they're a pop group, because they were around in the punk era, they've still taken that sort of ethos and done something a bit outrageous. And Joy Division as well, the band name's a Nazi brothel, and they got in a lot of trouble from that. They almost had to change the name. So yeah, punk will never die. It's still around now. You've got pop punk, punk rock. It's just loads of musical elements just still under that. But for me, I don't think it could ever happen again. Because at the time it was all word of mouth, and it was all a massive new thing, outrageous in the media. Sex Pistols went on telly and swore that had never been seen before, but now that's just all the norm, and it will never happen again. But you still get bands like Blink-182 and Green Day there. Blink-182, you wouldn't put them in the same like CD collection as the Spice Girls, but you wouldn't class them as punk. They're not really saying anything outrageous, but they have still got that fast, like furious sort of vibe about them. And just put Green Day in there because at the time, when they first started out, they had a massive underground following. Did everything by themselves, they weren't signed to any deals or anything. Just had this massive following. They were seen as proper punk, like bringing it back from the 70s. But then they signed up to a major record label and released Dookie, which was obviously like their biggest selling album, sold like 14 million albums. But I'm just linking that back to the Clash because that's what the Clash did, and it just goes to show that if you wanna live in the music industry, that's just something you've got to do. I've put the Libertines there as well because they were kind of close to breaking that. Like Pete Doherty behaved with the drugs and just being like outrageous, and they released the first album in 2002 and they were split up by 2004, so just making that sort of, you know, happen fast, and then it's all just ended. So my main point of the whole investigation was the link between Malcolm McLaren and Simon Cowell. I've not brought Simon Cowell up yet, but basically McLaren had an eye for catching a trend. So he went to America, brought punk back, spurred that whole movement, and then in the 80s he did the exact same thing. He went over to America, discovered hip hop, brought it back to England, and that became another massive influential genre over here. So the link with Simon Cowell, like obviously Simon Cowell's around today. Both kind of man-made a band, put them together. Like, I'm just going to use One Direction as an example for Simon Cowell, like what McLaren did with Sex Pistols. All they bothered in is their own profits, and so Simon Cowell's put together One Direction, and but going in an opposite direction to how McLaren did it. McLaren did it with making these like sort of strange outfits, sort of promoting anger and drugs for people to get into it that way. Whereas Simon Cowell was more about everything being polished, like these are the perfect boys, to try and get fans in a different way, like young girls and mums probably. Do you know what I mean? So like that's how they're similar. punk was over in 12 months, and everything at the time, everything seemed possible. Like anyone could do anything. You didn't need to play guitar to be a lead guitarist. You didn't need a sewing machine to make clothes. It was all about a DIY ethos. You've got nothing else to do. You sat in these homes, like taking drugs, not really doing anything with your life. But as soon as these bands came out and people started seeing it, yeah, I can do that as well. And just apart from that as well, that's where a lot of bands after the punk came from. Like without people thinking that, you probably wouldn't have had half as many bands that are minimal today. Basically, from punk we've got a lot of ambassadors of the music industry today. So you've got like Vivienne Westwood, still a massive fashion designer. She's done really well for herself. People still buying her clothes today. You've got the fanzine writers, who, like I said before, they write for newspapers, they are news journalists today. You've got big figures in music still, so you've got Mick Jones from The Clash, who's the guitarist. He's now a music producer. He produced Libertine's first album. You've got Paul Weller. He's still going strong. He promotes small bands. You've got all these characters that have come from that crazy year, who are now massive influences and role models for people still in the music industry today. Yeah. Cheers.
Brill, any questions?
Would you say the punk era inspired you as a musician?
Me as an individual, no. But I suppose in a way it has, because a lot of artists that I listen to were inspired by the punk movement or were involved in it. So in a way that's kind of inspired me, I suppose.
Anyone else? Do you think there are any genres now that you could really link with the punk movement? Not necessarily musically, but does that spirit kind of still live on?
Yeah, of course it does. Obviously, like people making their own electronic music today, they're not signed up to a record label. They're just sat at home doing it themselves. Exactly what they would have been doing at the time. So
Yeah. Okay. Well done.